PSN at home, I am pleased to introduce our guest this morning, Travis Karicofe. He has 25 years of fire and EMS experience in also with flight medicine. He's a flight medic, tactical EMS, and he is the EMS officer for the City of Harrisonburg Fire Department in Virginia. Travis's previous work experience comes from the Virginia State Police Aviation Medevac Unit, where he did serve as a flight medic. He is also a credentialed SWAT paramedic and is a member of the Virginia Division II Urban Search and Rescue Team. Travis teaches across the state doing multiple fire and EMS classes. He's also led national lectures and training programs for special operations team for both federal and military operations response teams, which include the FBI, the U.S. Marine Seabirth Command, as well as the U.S. Army 911 engineers. So I'm pleased to welcome Travis this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Very good. Thanks for having me. I'm truly honored to be here.
Well, we are going to be talking today about the amazing cardiac resuscitation program that the City of Harrisonburg is running. Tell us, Travis, what the problem was you were trying to solve in the city with the resuscitation program and what you are continuing to do to improve the outcomes of that program's implementation.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. So the first thing is we're delighted to have learned from a lot of very successful other programs across the United States. And to be quite honestly, we haven't invented any new science or anything. In fact, what we've done is we've taken a look at the American Heart's chain of survival, which emphasizes earliest recognition of cardiac arrest. The second one is getting bystander involvement, and with an AED being third, and then great basic life support, advanced life support by EMS. And then once you have resuscitation, optimal post-resuscitation care. So originally, about 6 or 7 years ago when I came to the city, cardiac arrest, survival, and resuscitation was probably a little bit below national average, probably consistently in single digits. And what we did was the fire chief made it a priority to figure out how we can learn from other people and we can embrace technology at all levels of that 5-level chain to resuscitate our patients and ultimately provide good outcomes where they can walk out of the hospital, return to society, and earn a living, support their families, and contribute, be full functional. So that's the kind of what teed us off on that. Prior to that, we didn't have any data collection or any technology to assist us with that. There was no real-time feedback to evaluate the effectiveness of CPR. Our communication center they're very effective, and our public safety telecommunicators do a fantastic job, but they weren't armed with some technology tools that would probably benefit them. And we took a look at all 5 levels of that and seeing where we can introduce technology with our outstanding men and women that we have on the front line and improve cardiac arrest. And just real quick today, if you have cardiac arrest in our city and it's witnessed and someone, a bystander or anybody, put their hands on the patient to do CPR, our resuscitation rate of that category is 92 to 94% consistently. And those numbers vary because we have about 40 cardiac arrests a year. So each arrest carries a fair amount of percentage. So it can vary. And that's why we look at it in portions of 2 years at a time.
Those are some impressive results. So you went from single digits to the 90 percentile of survival rates. In what time frame are we talking that you saw those results?
We saw some of those ramp up immediately. And when I say that, over 12 to 18 months. The other part to that story, and this is where my colleagues that are in this industry and physicians and subject matter experts will tell you, we get a lot of resuscitations back, and the percentage of people that walk out of the hospital is what we're looking at. And I have to back up and say that our percent of that is anywhere from 42% to 30%, and it's because it's based on numbers. However, before we implemented some technology that you're going to ask me about, and I'm going to tell you, our percent of folks that walked out of the hospital was almost usually never.
Wow. So yeah, tell me about the technology, the interventions you're using now, and what you see coming down the pike in the future to help improve those longer term survival rates.
Absolutely. So we couldn't do it without two things. We couldn't do it without robust technology that folks are out there looking at and being responsive to our demands and things. And we couldn't do it without our phenomenal folks on the front lines, the firefighters, the men and women riding forward and facing backwards. So we started with when the person calls 911, because the thing about cardiac arrest is we know that time is critical. For every 1 minute that you're pulseless, your chances of survival decrease 10%. So if there is a lack of public recognition, they make the 911 call, it gets held up in the 911 center. So we have invested into pulse point technology to alert our public and launch a campaign to get involvement with that. Included in that is defibrillator pre-planning and alerting to let them know. So that shaves off a few seconds. And the way that we look at it is the penny saved in seconds will pay minutes saved in benefit if we start at us. Like when you were a kid, your parents would tell you pennies make dollars, you should save them all. We look at that time-wise, because if you lose time, you can never regain it in this situation. So pulse point technology to speed up the notification to 911. Our city invested in a new 911 center software and technology, and included in that is call processing software, a technology called PowerPhone, where when the call comes in and the dispatcher starts typing details, it'll recognize real quick that it's a cardiac arrest by key terms. It pushes it over to a dispatcher. They begin to start queuing up the response. At the same time, to get our folks on the front lines a jump start, we have station alerting software where they can see that there's a call in queue that's being prepared to dispatch and the address, and they know by response who's going to be the closest and not. So a lot of times their folks have got the jump start on dispatch. Meanwhile, at the same time, their phones are alerting with pulse point, and they're out the door. And by the time they mark responding on their mobile data terminal, they're well on their way. And that has been probably the single most important thing. And my industry subject matter expert colleagues will agree, getting out the door fastest is the most effective thing we can do. So we've got the 911 call, the technology there to facilitate that, the communication center, getting our folks out the door as fast as they can. We've invested in some cutting edge technology to allow us, once they get there, to know if our CPR is effective or not. And we have became 100% Zoll customer. So we are armed with a Zoll X series monitor and defibrillators where we don't have those. Those provide real-time feedback technology. So now our CPR is not just anecdotal that we think we're doing it good or it's effective. We now have technology that can tell them, hey, you need to push harder, you need to push faster. And on the backside of that, we can run a quality review report and look at and figure out. And if we look at it and there's a pause in CPR and we're like, whoa, we got a longer than 10-second pause here, what happened? And one of the medics will speak up and say, yeah, you know, the supraglottic airways, you know, we're having trouble with those, or there was a piece of equipment that was in the way, it was laying here. And we go back, and this goes back to seconds. We're down to whittling out how we deploy our equipment in bags, where we place the monitor, where the IV should start it and everything. And we literally are as orchestrated as a NASCAR pit crew with how things should go and operating the same every day on every call. So now we're to the point now where we're using technology to assist us. Now we have technology that on the scene is communicating with technology, because we're using auto pulse chest compression devices that are now communicating with our cardiac monitor, and the two are kind of communicating back and forth. And now we've got consistency there, and we're minimizing interruptions in CPR. let alone the fact we know how good our CPR is. We're in the process of implementing Zoll ventilators in cardiac arrest so that we don't overventilate our patients, which reduces the effectiveness of CPR. All of those things, when you look at it on the surface, are minimal elements of success. But when you start adding those up, it's pennies making dollars in success. And then our protocols have become fairly sophisticated in terms of when we get resuscitation, what the priorities of work are for the medics. We need to immediately get a blood pressure that's compatible with what's determined to be supportive for brain perfusion, and taking a pause. And that's one of the things that's helped us a lot. Is a lot of responders will get resuscitation, then there becomes this hype. We got to get out of here. We need to get to the hospital. A cath lab's waiting, so on and so forth. And everything that you gain, you lose. The patient rearrests and they don't know it. So one thing that we've done that takes a little bit of time but pays dividends in more success is we take about a 5 or 10 minute pause when they get a pulse back in a patient, and they take that pause to take a deep breath, see physiologically how the patient's responding to all these drugs they gave them, establish a blood pressure that's compatible with life, and create a treatment plan for moving that patient and transporting them to the hospital. Because what we know is if that patient's going to rearrest, it's probably going to be within 10 minutes of resuscitation. Statistically, if they survive longer than that, then they're probably going to survive the transport to the hospital. What we don't want to do is have the patient rearrest, not be in a position that's conducive for CPR and so forth. So in your mind, you're probably like, wow, there's a lot of gears and sprockets to this and everything. And what we've done is we've taken what other localities and other organizations have said works for them. And we've said, all right, well, they're kind of doing a round peg in a hexagon type hole. We're a hexagon type hole organization. So what can we take that works for them, kind of form it in what'll fit for us? And that's what we've done. And through this, I'm proud that we can pay some of that forward, and that somebody out there may learn from what we've done also. And then the other part to the technology aspect is we do a comprehensive call review with data that's obtained in real life time during the cardiac arrest. And that's benchmarks like shocks, interruptions in CPR, effectiveness in CPR. We're investing into the HandTevi app where in real time, it's easy to document epinephrine doses and procedure successes and things. So we do some of that with the Zoll now. And honestly, that technology and for us, the things that we can control, because it's a little harder to control the bystander part and everything. But when we've arrived on scene, I feel like the Zoll technology that we've implemented has completely revolutionized the way we treat cardiac arrest, and it's got us to where we're at today.
Do you have time in that 5 to 10 minute assessment process that you talked about once you get them back? Are you conducting any two-way video telemedicine with a physician at the hospital during that time, or really just relying on the Zoll 12 leads and what have you to assess?
Right. So we do establish communications. We don't telemedicine while it's available in an acute setting, particularly in a public place. There still remains some improvement for technology there if you're going to do it compliant. Certainly you can FaceTime, and I will say that there's been times where with traumas, our providers have FaceTimed a medical director to get some advice and things like that in a report, but there's almost always a cell phone call. Now, the thing that I'm very exciting about is our Zoll X Series monitors are soon going to be getting a software and a hardware upgrade where the hospital can log into a portal and our medic on the scene can allow it, and they can see in real time everything that's going on the cardiac monitor screen. So they can see it for themselves. Right. We're fortunate in that our credibility level is so good that when we share that information, they're like, well, don't feel like you have to buy that because of us, because we trust 100% of what you say, and your medics are, we don't quite need that, but they're going to see benefit in that. And some of the patients that we're thinking about with that may be a patient who stays in ventricular fibrillation, but we get an auto pulse on them, they're intubated, we're using an impedance threshold device, and these are the patients that start opening their eyes and they start having purposeful movement. There is some interest in taking that patient with that technology package on them to the cardiac cath lab and actually cathing them when they're in cardiac arrest. There's systems in the United States that have seen success with some of those patients. That's a smaller group, but to that small group, that's very important to those patients and their outcome.
Tell me about some of the unique victims that you've treated. You have a college nearby within your jurisdiction, and you've had some interesting results and data from some fairly young folks that have suffered cardiac events. Is that right?
Absolutely. So we have 2 4-year colleges in our city. The 2 of them combined with faculty is about 44,000 folks. So it's kind of a collegiate city of its own. We had one case where there was a 19-year-old student. She was running on a treadmill, perfectly healthy, no past medical history, suddenly collapses in cardiac arrest. We arrived there, start doing CPR, and the medics are working this code phenomenally with good ACLS, good basic life support, good compressions, good feedback on the cardiac monitor. They intubate her, they're getting exhaled CO2 levels that are just phenomenal. And they're 10 minutes in, and this young lady still remains pulseless. She was in a PEA type rhythm, and 15 minutes rolls around and they're like, what's going on? And she's kind of even moving. That's how good the CPR is. And at about the 35-minute mark, there was a significant increase in exhaled CO2, and she regained a pulse. The long story short, she was stabilized on scene hemodynamically, transported to the hospital, gave target temperature management, the hypothermia treatment for about 48 hours. And what they determined with her was she had an undiagnosed hypertrophic heart, a congenital defect. So she got a defibrillator implanted, and interestingly enough, in her course, they started looking at her parents, and her dad was identified as being the genetic carrier, and he went through a cardiovascular workup, and on echo, they found out that he has the exact same congenital defect that she does, and it would only be a matter of time until he experienced the same. So they immediately put him on medication, and basically us saving her life and the information they were able to get from her ultimately will lead to him, thankfully, not ever experiencing cardiac arrest. So that was interesting. And you have someone like that, and this is where science is very and data is kind of perplexing, because how do you have one person who is pulseless for 35 minutes and they have an outstanding neurologic outcome, and you could have another patient, same age, same makeup and everything else, who is only pulseless for 5 or 10 minutes, and their neurologic outcome is devastating, and maybe they're withdrawn from life support, or their end outcome is a vegetative state. And that's where we remain perplexed. That's where there's a lot of ground for medicine to break in figuring out things other than what we know. And that's outstanding basic life support and defibrillation. And interestingly enough, that is the only thing that there's a consensus in the resuscitation community on. But even at those both being optimal in both scenarios I gave you, 2 different outcomes, and we still work and we rely on scientists to help us figure that out, what predictors are.
Well, congratulations. That is an amazing program, Travis. I know it sounds like you do continuous improvement after every call, which is fantastic. And, really a tribute to you and your team for bringing such a great program to the citizens in your community. I have one last question for you that's pandemic related. You're hearing a lot in the news about folks who are afraid of the virus, have a very strong fear of being exposed to it. And so they are waiting to call 911 until almost it's too late in some cases. They're waiting for these acute conditions to get very, very bad, which of course puts additional stress on the medics and the other EMTs who are responding to these calls. With your experience in running this program, these types of programs, what advice would you give your community about calling 911 during the pandemic and the precautions that you all are taking and help allay some of those fears?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there's a lot of moving parts to that. And probably, and I'll say it with a straight face. The media reports on that, and maybe what the true problem with that is could be broadly different. Yeah. I will tell you that in our community, in our region, we don't have people dying on the street. We haven't seen an uptick in cardiac arrest. We have seen, by nature of COVID, some interesting cardiac patients and respiratory patients, and we even have had some very interesting postpartum patients that, because of the novel Corona-19 virus, have presented uniquely. We haven't really seen an uptick in calls that we run in people who don't have COVID being sicker because they've avoided care. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, and I'm sure it's out there. And I would say anyone who feels like they need to call 911 should. Our healthcare system in this country, abroad, painting it with a broad paintbrush, is robust compared to other countries. And our public safety system in the United States is robust. We certainly have deserts of service in some areas, but far and abroad, our responders they're prepared, they're equipped. The public should never feel uncomfortable calling 911. The CDC just put out a report where they took a look, and abroad emergency room visits were down about 42% during COVID. Primary care and hospital services, orthopedic surgery, cardiovascular services, they all closed for a certain period of time. In my community, the ER visits are definitely down, and we don't see folks dying on the street per se. And I think the other way to look at this may be, has the community been relying on emergency medicine as a source of primary care? That in the ideal world, if we could reach out and we could provide primary care and primary health care equity abroad, this may be what our emergency rooms would look like on a normal basis, that they would see 50% or less of their folks, their patients that come in there. And if there's any ER folks watching this, they're nodding their head yes, because that's the case with it. But I don't think anybody should hesitate to call 911. And that's what we market ourselves, as a one-hat solution. If we can't help you, we're going to find somebody who can, or we're going to take you somewhere they can. And the public should never be discouraged from calling 911.
Great. Thanks, Travis. We really appreciate you joining us today, and hope to talk to you in the future, getting some continued results on your program, maybe another year or so, just to see how it continuously improves. Great work you're doing down there. To everybody, thank you for joining us at PS at Home this week, and we'll see you next time.
Very good. Thank you.